So I'm going to begin by explaining some of the paradigms of constellation therapy. And first of all, what is it? Uh, you have an issue and you take it to a group of strangers, or you may know each other a little bit, but it's often a group of strangers. So you have an issue, you take it to a group of strangers, and in that group of strangers, you focus on the issue. And every issue has various people involved. So maybe you have an issue with your mother, and then some person in the group agrees to occupy the role of your mother. And maybe your mother is a difficult thing with your father. And you kind of explore a topic and who it affects in your relationship system. Your relationship system is anyone who has any meaning or significance in your life now or in the past. And then there's a facilitator. There is a facilitator there who asks certain questions and directs people around in certain ways in response. And this is constellation therapy. Now, the goal of constellation therapy is that you bring patterns to consciousness and form a healthier relationship with the pattern, thus healing a disease, sometimes a physical disease, but normally an emotional, mental disease of some kind, a pain, a grief, a inner conflict, etc. And so that's what all therapy is. It's about integrating the self, resolving paradoxical conflicts, etc. So this is the goal, and that's a very simplified version of what happens. And I became very interested in constellation therapy again after reading how powerful it was for Bessel van der Kolk. Again, just really appreciating the depth of, it's like reading his book, The Body Keeps the Score. I felt like I was looking across the landscape of cultures and time in this subject of trauma. And so it was very interesting to follow along and see what worked and didn't work for him. Now, in looking at the mechanics of constellation theory or constellation therapy, the first thing to look at is field theory. And Rupert Sheldrake, among others, have developed this paradigm of morphogenetic field. But a field can also be understood as, for example, if you play a note on iron filings on a piece of steel, the filings will organize themselves into a geometric pattern. And so there's a connection between geometry and sound that we see as vibrations in the steel organize these random chaotic particles into a field pattern that we would say, oh, that's a five-pointed this or a flower-like structure here. Now, there's also overlaid on field theory, which is this idea that that there are patterns in consciousness that become patterns in relationship, that become patterns in culture, and vice versa. There are these patterns of energy, and that these patterns are on an evolutionary they're on an evolutionary journey, from simpler patterns to more complex patterns, from asymmetrical patterns to more symmetrical patterns, to patterns in conflict to patterns in harmony, and that some of the biggest patterns exist in this juxtaposition between the illusionary isolation of the human ego and the pattern of life around the ego, the larger ecology. Now, overlaid on field theory is fractal theory or holographic theory. And holographic and fractal theory say that within every part of the whole, the entire whole is contained. So this is that dynamic where within the human ego is contained the possibility of divinity, and within divinity is the human ego. If you break a holographic image, you take a holographic image and you cut it into 100 pieces, a skilled scientist can reconstruct the bigger hologram from a tiny piece of it, because the light patterns that create the hologram are fractal in nature. And what fractal refers to is the same thing, that you can keep a pattern of repetition getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, but it's the same basic repetitive pattern with slight variations. It just gets endlessly smaller and endlessly bigger, which is saying the same thing. So to look at a pattern in a fractal nature, you'd look at the cult or culture as the group ego, and then you'd look at the individual as the individual ego. And you would expect within field fractal theory that you could discover and understand the cult in which the ego was brought up by studying the ego, because the cult would have indentations, would make impressions on the ego such that one could infer from the ego, you're a scared ego. There must have been things that scared you. You're a traumatized ego. There must have been things that scared you to your sense of survival, and then you didn't recover. So then you can discover, there's a sociopathic element in this cult. Otherwise, this ego would have recovered from their trauma. They haven't recovered. That means they grew up in an environment that created trauma and then didn't repair it. Well, that's the definition of sociopathic. And so you can start to infer, you had nightmares when you were a child. Doesn't sound like you felt incredibly attuned with either one of your parents as safe guardians or whatever, So you can infer from the one what's going on in the group. And this is, of course, known by groups, which is why they hate truth tellers or whistleblowers or shadow enablers, the sensitives that tell the truth of what's going on in everyone's psyche by embodying it in themselves. This is why we shun the truth tellers, because if they are, if they tell the truth about their life, they are in fact telling the truth about the entire circle. And so, that's why there's so much effort. Don't say that. Don't tell anyone that. Don't. Why? Because you're telling my story as well. If people see it in you, they may see it in me. If they see your terror, they may see the cruelty of us as your parents. So you're not scared, right? Right? Here, have a lollipop. You're not scared. We're good, right? Okay. Let's all put on this, because I don't want you to see me either. And now, in the same dynamic, where you can tell a cult by an individual and you can predict an individual by a cult. Every cult has a set of protocols, and in the framework of those protocols, they produce a statistic. For example, if rape is not against the law and is just considered fine, you'll have a much higher degree of rape, particularly in a sociopathic culture. If it's highly focused on and punishable by death, suddenly not so much rape. And so this goes up and down through the individual and the cult. Now, the same fractal type pattern happens with the individual, ego, and a group, with the conversations that go on inside a person's head and the conversations that went on in their family. For example, if a son was raised by a very domineering mother, he will hear domineering statements as he lives his life. She's not around, but he's internalized the family pattern into an egoic level. Now, what Constellation Therapy does is it does the reverse. By working with a group of people, maybe 5, 10, 20 volunteers and witnesses, the conversations inside someone's head that were downloaded from the group in which they grew up with influence now get uploaded to a group. But there's a big difference. They're getting uploaded to a group of strangers. Now, what field theory says is that there's a field around every pattern, around every individual, around every culture that anyone can tap into. And as they tap into it, they can embody and attune to that field. And they can then represent roles within that field. And so, and people are being invited into doing this. Now, this breaks with the materialistic rationalism of mainstream science. So it takes a little bit of a leap for a Westerner, in most cases, to do that, because there's a little bit of tension. The materialist sciences don't like acknowledging this type of stuff. They're very afraid of it because it ruins the priesthood of materialism. If you can convince everyone that there is nothing that exists that is not material, then if you are the material priest, meaning you understand material workings better than anyone else, then you're the god of the whole cult. And so it's, the greatest trick in, the oldest trick in the book. Convince the entire world that the only sphere of influence is geometry, and I'm the best geometrist, so I should be, the leader of the whole species. But whereas, okay, you're the best geometrist, but life isn't only geometry; it's also trigonometry. It's also cooking. It's also this, and so is the best cook. And it's like, oh, I've got to share the influence. I've got to share the power. So materialist science, I want a simple version of reality where I'm king. Multidimensional science and reality. There's material science and there's energetic science, and there's all kinds of different octaves and levels that do and don't work with different paradigms. Now, the interesting thing when you're trying to bring balance and symmetry and grace to a pattern, you need to make changes towards symmetry, balance, and grace. Now, in order to do that, you've got to see the asymmetries and the dis-ease of the current pattern. It's obvious. How do you do that? Well, you've got to see what the pattern is. Now, this is a problem because if you look at a family system and you understand that the pattern is diseased, there's going to be someone with too loud a voice and someone who is too small a voice. Now, in a chauvinistic culture, the one with too loud a voice may not want to tone it down a bit. They may want to keep their dominant position. And the one with a small voice may be afraid of the power. But that shift has to take place for the system to come back into grace. Now, this is hard to do in a family where maybe dad is punishing and bullying and using political clout to say, no, I'm not the dominant one, and don't you dare to say that I'm the dominant one or I'll kill you. It's like, oh, okay, you're not the dominant one. I don't want to be killed. And then someone else is saying, I don't want to be responsible and stuff. And so they're fighting it. The family, in their role, is fighting to keep the system the way it is. And then it's been internalized into an individual in the family as an imbalanced and thus dysfunctional system. Now, when you upload that system back to the group and expand it into a group of 20 where they occupy different roles, the beauty of working with strangers is they have no attachment. Now, the person who's playing dad is not going to get to bully you the rest of your life. They're playing dad for 2 hours. They've never met you before. And so they've got no incentive to warp the actual knowledge coming through the field into their own political agendas because they're not part of your system. They've got no attachment. And this is the beauty. This is the real genius of Constellation Therapy, is you can upload an accurate version of your family system into people that have no agenda other than getting to the truth as quickly as possible so that it's their turn to be at the center of the circle. And so they don't lie. They say, gee, I'm feeling this. I'm sensing this as your dad. I'm sensing this as your mom. And they have no other agenda other than to simply say, I sense this. I don't know these people. I don't care about them. This is what's coming up. And so it's possible for an individual and for the group to get a vision of the system in play that is way more accurate than if you called up the same relatives and said, tell me what you're feeling. What do you mean? What am I feeling? Why should I tell you what I'm feeling? But you ask someone who's playing that relative, what are you feeling? And they immediately say, I feel overwhelmed with sadness and grief and and I feel so depressed. And I don't want anyone to find out about it, because if they found out about it, it would never end, and and I don't feel, and then I'd look small, and I don't want to be small, and oh my goodness. And they say, that's what's going on. That's why every time I ask my aunt what her feeling is, she changes the subject and throws up smoke and mirrors. I see, now I know what's going on in that part of the system. So, Auntie, why are you so sad? Well, I blame myself for the death of my cousin, and I didn't know you had a cousin. Well, I do. And your father covered it up. I took the thing and they did this, and then your father won't talk about this and this, and so, that's why my father's so mad about this. Oh, I see, I understand. And it comes through without censorship. So you get truth to consciousness. You no longer have all of the different egos of everyone involved defending it. And there's also, you don't have to worry about being hit or being disinherited along the way. And so the individual ego exploring the family system is far more open around the whole dynamic than they would be otherwise. And so this is the beauty of the family system, to exploring it, because then you can download from that a more accurate version of the family system, and with responses that bring well-being. And so the lack of attachment equals honesty. The group, what it does is, because you could have this constellation go on in your own head, and this is another form of work called chair work, where you set up a circle of chairs and you move back and forth from different chairs and you play all the roles. The trouble is, when you're playing all the roles, is you do have an agenda. All those strangers, they don't care whether your father raped you because he hated you or raped you because he was confused and terrified and trying to distract himself from his terror. They don't care. They just say what comes up for them, and they feel it as soon as they're part of the ritual, because they're tuning into the field, which means there's a sound, there's a vibration that will make it much easier for them if they fit into the underlying family pattern. And this is the real talent, how to orchestrate the presencing of the field in such a way that people can easily step into the pattern of those iron filings. So now you have a group synergy, and part of this comes with the magnification. Every single person is focusing 100% on their personal role in the system, which means the witness, the person watching, can look at the whole system and not just their role. And so you get an amplification of detail, which leads to an amplification of language, which leads to an amplification of consciousness. And then out of that amplification, now you have an awareness. An awareness, first of all, that it's not personal. It's just, I'm in this role, in this system, and here's my part, and here's the things that I can and cannot do around that. And so there's one final piece around trauma. The ego cannot deal with trauma alone. And many of the most fixated events, fixated meaning they're stuck there, many of the most fixated events in traumatic history are events that are too big for the ego to deal with alone, one, and two, the ego is left to deal with them alone, so three, the ego goes into a coping avoidant pattern where the thing never gets done, so it stays stuck because they can't deal with it alone. So many people are in holding patterns like that. Now, what space holding, if that whole energy is held by an entire group, what that does as an entire group in space holding traumatic events is the group can hold the trauma. I can't cry because it's too much, but you can cry. I can't do this, this, and this, but you can do this, this, and this. I can't do blah, 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 blah. But I can watch you burst into anger or tears and understand that that's a part of me, that that's in my body. And that can give me the courage to participate in a group release where it's like a pressure cooker that was too violent to take the whole lid off. Now you've got 8 little ports all steaming it out through pressure valves, and it's not too much for any one person. Then at the end of that, you get your freedom back. You're no longer in a coping mechanism. The charge has been reduced to a level that it is manageable. And this is the beauty of constellation therapy. Now, I've personally I went to a constellation therapy session just to see what was up, and I got to play a role, and I immediately felt that, like, I feel this, and my body feels like this. And then there was another time when I got to play a constellation therapy about myself, and I had a terrible facilitator that was trying to push it in direction that it didn't want to move, and I experienced a truly transcendent moment working with invisible figures in the constellation, meaning I had the whole witnessing of the room, but I said, this being is here, I'm working with this, I'm doing this, and I just described an invisible constellation where energy patterns came into the room, and I related to them until the pattern was done, and I felt in a state of transcendent, and beautiful grace. And it just needed the space holding. So people didn't actually physically occupy the role because the facilitator wasn't that good. He tried to intervene. I said, no, leave me to do it alone. And I experienced the epiphany. After being traumatically abused by my therapist, one of the places I turned to was a constellation therapist, and was able to experience a phenomenal pattern where it didn't feel safe, having just been violated and betrayed by my therapist and this and that and the other. It didn't feel safe to deal with human beings, because human beings at their deepest level were in this pattern of deep betrayal and violation. And so the constellation therapist played the role of various deities. And I would describe the deity, and he would get into the role and play the deity, and then I would relate to the deity. And what was fascinating about this is, as soon as I was in relationship with the deity, all my stress, all my grief, all my exhaustion and pain vanished. All my sense of imperfection, all my sense of shame vanished. And I realized that I was absolutely perfect, that I didn't need to change anything to be in relationship with this deity. When my imperfection came back was when I related to other human beings, including the therapist, because the therapist did not know how to honor where I was, and nor did my other therapists, and nor did my family, etc., understand how to honor me where I was. So I was carrying the shame that my culture didn't know how to relate to me in trauma and in sexual abuse. And so there's this big disconnect. And that disconnect goes both ways. I don't know how to relate to them. They don't know how to relate to me. But a deity knows how to relate to me and knows how to accept me. And so I know how to relate to a deity. I just be myself, And so this was a phenomenal experience. However, there is often a split between the information that leads to greatest light and healing coming through in the field, and the ego and opinions. As you form a personal relationship with a therapist, you become subject to their beliefs, their biases, etc. And so I experienced the imprisonment of my therapist's judgments and beliefs in the constellation work as sessions continued. And I started to feel like, that's not what's in the field. You're not reading the field. You're reading your own judgments and biases about yourself. And then the work stopped feeling safe. When I realized I had to double check stuff because my therapist was getting attached to the what this meant. Like, if this is true for Dane, what does that mean about me and all this stuff? And so then there becomes the attachment, and the honesty is curtailed. The honesty comes, that freedom of talking with a stranger, because I don't care what you say, so I'm going to tell you the truth. As you form a dependent relationship with a therapist, he needs me for the money, or I need him for validation, or whatever this, and there's more and more details known, then there's the sense, well, I know what's going on an ego level that starts interfering with the field knowledge. And so when I started noticing that magnificent transformation was starting to be replaced, with uncertainty and paranoia and stuff like that, it was healthy to let go of the relationship, and so that was kind of the end of that kind of dynamic of constellation work. But I'm very excited about this paradigm. I'm very excited about the opportunity to participate in more and more constellation things. And I think it's very important to understand that 20 people can be doing this with very little training just because they can, and that this is a very, very luminous and intelligent direction for our culture.